Psychological Research, BA Honours, PSY 05. Good morning, all my dear friends. How are you? Must be enjoying the chilly morning. North is very cold today. So let us talk about something academic so that a warmth comes in us. Academic. Today topic is application of psychology test. You see, when we say there is science, in science, we are to measure the aspects which we are going to study. In psychology, there are various methods we'll talk about: observation, interview, case study, questionnaire. Similarly, one of the method is psychological tests. Now, psychological tests are very important. I am saying very 4 times important because they are used in the numerous places at the various fields. So, today we will talk about why we are using psychological tests, what are types, and in which areas these psychological tests will be used. So, let us start application of psychological test. Psychology is the science which studies human and animal behavior. To study the behavior, various methods are used like introspection, experiment, case study, interview, observation, etc. As I told you just now, introspection was the earlier method. Nowadays, we are not using, but earlier it was used. The first laboratory of psychology was opened in 1879 by William Wundt in Germany at Leipzig. The early experimental psychologists of the 19th century were not in general concerned with the measurement of individual differences. The principal aim of psychologists of that period was the formulation of a generalized description of human behavior. It was the uniformities rather than the differences in behavior that were focus of attention. Individual differences were either ignored or accepted as necessary evil that limited the applicability of the generalization. Thus, the fact that one individual reacted differently from another when observed under identical condition was regarded as a form of error. The presence of such error or individual variability rendered the generalization approximately rather than exact. This was the attitude towards the individual difference that prevailed in such laboratories as founded by William Wundt. Now, William Wundt is supposed to be the father of psychology. He established first psychological lab at Leipzig, as I have told you, in 1889. Now, they were studying the psychological processes and the aim was generalization, general application of whatever they were doing. When the same experiment was done by different people, there were some minor differences in the results. Then the students asked William Wundt, "Sir, there are some differences." Then at that time the attitude was, ignore it. No need to worry, because whenever you do, there are some differences. So either it is evil, ignore it, or you shouldn't pay attention to these individual differences. But what happened? At the same time, Kettle was a student of William Wundt. He was doing his research. He didn't accept this logic that individual differences is evil, it should be ignored. He said, no, if there are differences, there must be some reason behind that. So despite the resistance at that time, Kettle for the first time used the term test, I will tell you, and he did his PhD. His topic was individual differences in reaction time. So when reaction time is time to react, everybody takes different time to react. So he says, no, individual differences are important and they must be studied. So an especially prominent position in the development of psychological testing is occupied by American psychologist James Kettle. The newly established science of experimental psychology and still the newer testing movement merged in the Kettle's work. Kettle was a student of William Wundt lab, so experimentalist. He thought about individual differences, so testing. So these two angles merged in the work of the Kettle. For his doctorate at Leipzig, he completed dissertation on individual differences in reaction time despite Wundt's resistance to this type of investigation. I have just told you, despite the resistance, he did the work on the individual differences in reaction time. So, Kettle completed his dissertation PhD on the topic individual differences in reaction time. Despite Wood resisted that there is no need, but he said, no sir, if there are differences, we must study. While lecturing at Cambridge in 1888, Kettle's own interest in the measurement of individual differences was reinforced by contact with Galton. On his return to America, Kettle was active both in the establishment of laboratories for experimental psychology and in the spread of testing movement. In an article written by Kettle in 1890, the term mental test was used for the first time in psychological literature. Kettle was invited to deliver a lecture at the Cambridge, where he came in the contact with the Galton. You know, the Galton was doing a work on the individual differences. Everyone, he established a anthropometric lab where he was measuring, intelligence, weight, difference in the height, like that. So when he came in the contact of the Galton, who? Kettle. So his idea of the individual differences was reinforced. So when he returned to America, he spreaded two movements: experimental, which was his basic training in the Woods lab, and the movement of psychological testing. And in 1890, for the first time in psychological literature, the word mental test was used. Now, before we come to the application of psychological testing, we must have little bit idea, in very brief, that what are the different type of the tests. If you divide tests, personality test, classification will be different. Intelligence test, it will be different. But I am talking about here the general classification of the psychological test, because when I will talk about the application, then these points may come and we must be clear before that. So generally, psychological tests may be classified in the following categories. Number one, verbal test. Verbal tests are those tests where the stimulus is in the form of some language. Such tests are used for literates. You know, stimulus means if you are to test the intelligence of any person, you will have to give some material. That material is which form? If the material is in the form of the language, for example, I have written item in Hindi, stimulus will be in Hindi. If I have written in English, it will be English. I generally get headache. Now, this is verbal. Now, I become nervous when I go to the audience. It is language. This language may be Bengali, it may be Urdu, it may be Hindi, it may be English, it may be Tamil, whatever it is. So, whenever the items, the stimulus in the form of some language, it is called verbal test, and such tests are used for the literates who know the language, who are educated, because a person doesn't know the language, he can't read, he can't fill up the test. The second is the non-verbal test. Non-verbal tests are those where the stimulus is in the form of some figure or material. Non-verbal tests are also known by another name, performance test. However, there is a hairline difference. In the performance test, one has to construct something from a given material. Non-verbal tests can be administered on literates as well as illiterates. Now try to understand. The second type of the tests are non-verbal. In the non-verbal, the questions which we call items, they will not be in the language. There will be certain figures and you are to complete that figure. Remember, if you have appeared some examination of the banking or some examination of the competitive exam, now there are figures, one big triangle, then small triangle, then small triangle. Next, what will be the next? If I have a square, in the one corner 5 cross, in the second corner 4, in the third class 3, what will be in the last? There will be 2. Like that, among the figures, you are to respond. Now, most of the people give another name to the non-verbal, that is performance. But there is a hairline difference, and that difference must be clear to you. Performance means doesn't work on the geometrical figures. So, non-verbal tests are those where figures will be given and you are to complete those figures as per the instructions. You might have seen such items in the banking examination, in the competitive examination, where the mental ability is tested. For example, the squares are made. in the first square, there are 4 corners. In the first corner, suppose there are 5 small cross. In the next 4, in the next 3, question will be what will be in the last? There will be 2. Some psychologists, some people, scholars call non-verbal as a performance test. Actually, there is a hairline difference between that, and that difference must be clear to you. In performance test, you will have to construct, you have to act made something on the given material. For example, I give a very small example. You might have seen the Rubik cubic game with the children are playing here and there. Now they may red line, blue line, then the cross, then the plus. Now they are not doing work on the geometrical figure. They are performing on a given task. If you are to perform on a given task, it will be called performance. If geometrical figures you are to work, it will be called purely, they both are non-verbal, but that will not be the performance. Performance means manipulating, performing, constructing something with your hands. So non-verbal tests are, they may be given to the literates as well as the illiterates. As a matter of fact, tell you, these tests were made because there are certain people who are illiterate, and if I want to measure their intelligence, I can't do the verbal testing. So this was the another classification. The third is the individual tests. These tests which can be administered on one individual at a time is called individual test. And group test, those tests which can be administered on more than one individual at a time are called group tests. Suppose you have such tests which can be administered only one individual at a time, that will be called individual test. If I have a test that I can administer on a larger group at a time, that will be called group test. For example, I have a test, I said 20 students are sitting before me, I said I am distributing, time limit is there or not, I will tell them, you fill up and give to me, that is called group test. Now, if the nature of the test is that you have to perform something, then I will have to note down the time. So that test will be called the individual time, because I can measure intelligence, personality, whatever you are measuring, one individual at a time. Actually, group tests were made during the First World War, because there was need to recruit the large number of soldiers, army men. So two tests were constructed, Army Alpha and Army Beta. That is used. Army Alpha was a verbal, I have told you what is verbal, and Army Beta was a non-verbal. So individual and group test. Speed test, the tests in which time limit is fixed are called speed test. Power test, the tests in which there is a no time limit are called power test. Now, if a time limit is given, well, I am giving you this test, you are to complete in 10 minutes, that is speed test. Power test, there is a no time limit, I am giving to you, whenever you complete, hand over to me, it will be called as the power test. So these were the types of psychological tests. We have talked about verbal, non-verbal, and in non-verbal I have told you performance, then individual, group, speed and power. Now we are coming, what are the applications, what are the uses of psychological testing? Psychological tests, why we are preferring psychological tests? Psychological tests are objective and standardized measure of a sample of behavior. As such, subjectivity is not involved. This is the main reason that application of psychological tests is very wide. Now, we have interview, we have observation, we have other methods also. But why we are preferring psychological tests in the field to measure the behavior? Because psychological tests are objective. They are objective. Objective means where no biases appear. Subjective where biases appear. Objective where no biases appear. Now, this objectivity is maintained in psycho. How? Instructions are fixed. Scoring is fixed. Administration procedure is fixed. Interpretation is fixed. If everything is fixed, there are no chance of the biases. When I measure your behavior through the interview, I may be biased. So, psychological tests are mainly preferred because they are objective and standardized. I will tell you in later lecture what is standardization, norms, reliability, validity. We will talk about in that detail. Here you are to simply understand because they are objective and formed on a set pattern. So, we prefer them in the measurement. The main areas in which psychological tests are used as follows. psychological tests in education, psychological tests in clinical psychology, counseling and guidance, industrial psychology, psychological tests in military setting. Frankly, I tell you, if I start telling you the application of the testing, it may take hours together. And no area in the life will be left where we are not using psychological tests. So, we have taken the broad area. So, first we will talk about how psychological tests are used in the education. Now, in the field of education, psychological tests are widely used. You need to know the IQ of the students basically, first of all. The tests may be used to measure intelligence quotient, that is IQ. Binet and Simon, 1905, constructed first, mind it, standardized intelligence test named Binet-Simon scale. Now, I am talking about the Binet-Simon scale used in the education testing. The France government, was worried about the education system. In the class, there are homogeneous students, there are heterogeneous students. Now, if the class is usually heterogeneous, some are very bright, some are average, some are below average, some are, genius. So, if I am to deliver my goods, deliver my education, I can't talk about the lower level. If I start from the lower level, the genius will not be benefited. If I start from their level, the lower level will not be able to understand. Then the problem came that can we measure the IQ? Then at that time, French government established, a commission under the chairmanship of Professor Alfred Binet in 1904. As a result of that commission, in 1905, the first standardized test in psychological testing was constructed, and that test is known as Binet and Simon. It measures IQ. What is IQ? It is a ratio of mental age and your chronological age. Because whatever word is coming, we must be clear about that. The formula is IQ is equal to mental age upon chronological age into 100. 100 we are multiplying MA upon CA, 100, simply to get rid of the decimal. To remove the decimal, it is no percentage, because the definition of IQ is a ratio of mental age and the chronological age. So, Binet and Simon was the first person who made the first standardized test. In education, achievement tests are widely used. An achievement test is a test of developed skill or knowledge. The most common type of the achievement test is a standardized test developed to measure skills and knowledge learned in a given grade level. We are not only measuring your IQ in education, we also measure achievement. Achievement means your competency in a particular subject in a given class. For example, I want to measure the achievement level of class 10th biology. Then my test will be achievement test of biology for class 10th students only. If I am for class 12th, that will be for the class 12th. Now, whatever I have taught them, intelligence test you can use anytime. You can measure my intelligence. But achievement test will be used when you have given me that learning, I have learned that subject. So, whatever education we are giving to the students, what is their achievement? It is not examination. Don't confuse it with your annual examination. Your annual examination is not standardized. If it is standardized, it is a process, then the paper will be leaked, it will be out. Now, it is simply testing your knowledge, what you have achieved. These tests are called achievement tests, and they will be different for all the classes, for all the subjects. So, the most common type of achievement test is a standardized test developed to measure skills and knowledge learned in a given level. So, first application we have talked about in the education. The second importance is psychological tests in clinical psychology. In order for a mental health professional to be able to effectively treat a client and know that the selected treatment actually worked or is working, he or she first must engage in the clinical assessment of the client. Clinical assessment refers to collecting information and drawing conclusion through the use of observation, psychological tests to determine what the person's problem is and what symptoms are there. Psychological tests are used to assess the client's personality, social skills, cognitive abilities, emotions, behavioral responses. Now, who made the first, we'll talk about later. First, I tell you. Now, we are talking about the application of psychological test in clinical psychology. In the clinical psychology, when a client comes to you, you must know his problem. You must know what symptoms he has. What are the referral issues? Referral issue means the problem which are disturbing him. Now, from where I will come to his problem? It may be interview. I have simple observation, but as I told you, in interview, we may be subjective. The respondent may not, the patient may not be able to respond. Observation might be sometime faulty. We may misconceive whatever the person is behaving. But psychological tests, since I have told you objective, so they are used. So psychological test you can use. Listen carefully what I am now saying, may be used pre-treatment and post-treatment. Now, a client has come to me with the problem of anxiety or depression. Now, I have administered psychological test, clinical assessment, I have done. I have seen that his score is very high, he is suffering from depression, so I must give my treatment, so I am giving psychotherapy. Now, after the therapy, his problems, which he has responded yes in the first, now he should say no. Now, my sleep is disturbed, yes. I am exhausted, yes. I get nervous, yes. I am worried about my future, yes. These problems are disturbing me. Now, I have given the counseling. Now, if my therapy is successful, then I will say, now my sleep is disturbed, no. I am worried about the future, no. I am uncertain, no. Because if the treatment is effective, the yes problem symptom must be converted to or symptomatic, or it must be converted to no. So, how you will know? You will know this by simply psychological testing. So, in clinical it is very, very important. The first inventory if you talk about personality test was Woodworth personal data sheet by Woodworth during the World War I. In the First World War, to measure the emotional stability of the soldiers, this test was constructed. So, first intelligence test was first standardized was a Binet-Simon, but the first personality test was Woodworth personal data sheet, which was developed during the World War I. The other test used in clinical psychology is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory MMPI, which was constructed by Hathaway and McKinley. CPI, California Psychological Inventory, constructed by Guff. Projective techniques like TAT, Rorschach, ink block test may also be used in the clinical testing. Now, I tell you, there are so many tests. If I say more than 100, now thousands, but I am talking about only the historical tests from where the beginning started. So, first Woodworth test was constructed, then a very important test was constructed by two persons, Professor Hathaway and Dr. McKinley. Professor Hathaway was Professor Emeritus, Minnesota University, and McKinley was a psychiatrist. So, this test is combination of a psychologist and a psychiatrist. They constructed a test which is known by MMPI. Now, people say, literature say, when this test came in the field, it brought revolution in the clinical assessment. Revolution. More than 300 tests have been constructed on the basis of MMPI. Almost in every country, it has been translated in its own language. French, Spain, Hindi, whatever the language you say, it has been translated in many languages, and number of researches have been done on taking as a tool MMPI. So, MMPI is very, very important. It measures 9 dimensions earlier, the 10th was added later, hypomania, schizophrenia, psychasthenia, masculinity, femininity, like that. We are not talking about here the tests in detail, we are talking about only application. So, you must know that MMPI, and the second is CPI, California Psychological Inventory. MMPI measures personality problems, whereas the California Psychological Inventory measures your potentials. So, I must say MMPI measures liabilities, that means my weaknesses, and CPI measures my assets, my positive aspects of the personality. Then we use projective technique like TAT, Rorschach, ink block test, and there are so many. Now, when I say projective technique, question may come in your mind, sir, what is the projective technique? You see, when I present a stimulus before you, if the stimulus is very, very clear, everybody will give one response, yes or no. But if the stimulus is relatively ambiguous, then everybody will interpret that stimulus in its own way. For example, I have a board before me, I make a window, a person is sitting behind the window and there is a queue. I ask you to interpret what is the line in that window. Now, responses will be different. Somebody will say it is to deposit the electricity bill, someone will say to get the roll number, someone say it is the admission letters, someone say it is a movie, someone say it is the railway station line, someone say it is for the ration, it is for the gas cylinder, what not. Because it is not clear that the picture is what is the situation. Now, I put a board, Delhi railway station, Delhi railway station. Now, if Delhi railway station is written there, everybody will say it is a line for the railway ticket. Now, the picture is clear. In projective techniques, whatever the stimulus we present, that is ambiguous and you are to interpret that, whereas in personality inventory like MMPI, the stimulus is clear and you are to respond in a yes, no, true, false category. Now, we will talk about psychological tests in counseling and guidance. The psychological tests help counselors to identify strengths and weaknesses and guide treatment in the best possible way for their clients. Vocational guidance is very important for young children. Most of the time they are confused that what profession they should opt. Psychologists, by using psychological tests, can assess interest, attitude, mental ability, aptitude, personality, and can provide proper guidance accordingly. You see, testing is also used in the counseling and the guidance. The basic difference between the clinical we talked about, in the clinical the problem will be intense. In counseling the problem will be the general problem, where the patient, or we not say patient, a person needs some help. Now, there is a student, he wants to opt a career, he is confused. So, whenever you will success in any job, you have interest for that, you have the aptitude, you have the IQ level at that, you have the personality like that. If I want to go for the marketing job, I should be extrovert, introvert will not able to do the marketing job. So, by psychological tests, we give the vocational guidance to the students also. Then other important area, psychological tests in industrial psychology. Psychological tests are often used in industrial and organizational psychology. It is often used to assess an individual's potential job performance as well. It can provide insight into person's strengths and weaknesses. Personality testing generally used to assess person's traits, motivation, and typical way of thinking. Now, you are to recruit the persons. Now, for the recruitment, we use generally interviews. Interviews are type of a situational test. But if we want to measure objectivity where no biases appear, then you can opt for the psychological tests. You may measure personality, that what type of personality you needed. If you are, suppose you are to select the persons for the intelligence area, spies, then the spies should not be that much extrovert, they must be some of the introvert. If you want to establish where the emotions are important, my emotions should be strong. A weak emotional person will not be able to work in the front, in the army. So, whatever the job you are doing, organization working, what are your requirements, you according to that you can measure those aspects, and in this way it is helpful for the industrial psychology. For example, in an organization, accidents are happening more. Now, what is in the personality of the individuals where the accidents, people more accident prone? So, we can determine tests and know the proneness towards the accidents. Now, for example, the Myers-Briggs type indicator assesses the person preference in 4 areas: extroversion, introversion, thinking, feeling, sensing, intuition, and judging, perceiving. Now, whatever you want, you can see. Cater's 16 PF test, it measures 16 PF, 16 personality factors. Then Hogan's personality test, Then one neo PI, as nowadays it is currently used, it measures five, it is based on a big five model, are used to evaluate personality. Similarly, aptitude can be assessed by GATB and DATB. GATB, General Aptitude Test Battery, DAT, Differential Aptitude Test. What is aptitude? Aptitude is the capacity to acquire a particular skill after the training. Now you are recruiting someone in the industrial setup. Now if after my training will be able to pick up the work, this your GATB or DAT will be measuring. So this way we can use in the area of the industrial. Now we can use psychological tests in military setting. The psychological tests play crucial role in military setting. SSB, your Selection Service Board, conducts psychological tests to assess candidates' personality traits, cognitive abilities, emotional stability, social skills to determine their suitability for a career in the Indian Armed Forces. Projective techniques is mainly used in SSB. Tests like TAT, WAT, word association tests are used for the recruitment. You see, in the army, military, the selection board is using most of the psychological testing and particularly projective techniques. They will be given the figures, some pictures will be given to you, and you have to write 2-3 lines, a small story, or you have to associate that. Similarly, word association test, a word will be given to you and you will have to, the very first response which comes to your mind. In this way, we can recruit the persons according to the personality traits, emotions which are required for a army soldier, a army person. So in this way, the psychological tests are used in the military setting also. So in today's lecture, we have talked about what is the importance of test, what are its different types, classification, and it's used in the clinical, it's used in the education, it's used in the guidance counseling, it's used in the industrial setup, and it's used in the army area. As I have told you earlier, there is no area where the psychological tests are not used. So we must be aware of this factor. Thank you very much.